Hello and welcome to this video tutorial covering Unit 6, User Access. This tutorial covers Section 1 of Unit 6, Authentication Databases and Users. Let's talk a little bit about the objectives for this particular unit. I'm going to talk about the difference between user and device authentication. We'll talk about the importance of user accounts. We'll talk about the Ruckus Zone Director features that utilize user authentication. I'll show you how to verify user credentials with the Zone Director's local database and how to configure local user accounts. Now, when it comes to giving users access to your wireless LANs, you have two general choices. You can either create your wireless LANs with open access, meaning that anyone can access them with no validation or authentication whatsoever, or you can implement some form of user or device authentication to ensure that only certain authorized people can access your wireless LAN services. If you decide to implement authentication, then you have two additional choices to make. Do you want to use device authentication or user authentication? Device authentication is the type where a person's device, such as a laptop or tablet, are authenticated onto the network based on something inherent and fixed to that device, such as its MAC address or serial number. The benefit to this type of authentication is that typically the human being that's using that device doesn't have to do anything to be authenticated onto the wireless LAN. The credentials needed are built into the user's device and automatically presented to the network. Downside to this method is that if someone steals that device, they too can gain access to the wireless LAN. The other alternative is user authentication, by which the human being has to type in some sort of credentials, usually a username and password, and by doing so, that individual is authenticated. The assumption here is that even if the laptop or tablet is stolen, the thief who stole the device won't be able to access the wireless LAN because they won't know the correct username and password when presented with the authentication prompts. In either case, whether using device or user authentication, the wireless network administrator has to configure a minimum of 3 things on the Zone Director controller. Now, assuming that an external authentication server will be used, such as a Radius or Active Directory server, and that the server has already been configured by someone else, the wireless network admin will need to configure the Zone Director to be able to communicate with that external server. If more than one authentication server will be used in the network, then the next task to be done is to configure the Zone Director to know which authentication server will be used for each specific feature requiring authentication. Lastly, roles must be configured for most features requiring authentication so that authenticated users are granted the appropriate permissions by the Zone Director. The most secure form of authentication is user authentication, which I previously described. There are several features offered by the Zone Director that make use of this type of authentication. One form of this is web authentication, also known as a captive portal. When selecting web authentication, the Zone Director itself contains the web page that is displayed to users where they must provide a username and password. The Zone Director then checks the credentials that the user has supplied using either its own local database or an external database on a Radius or Active Directory server. Another form of user authentication provided by the Zone Director is a guest pass captive portal. By using this feature, certain employees in your company would be designated as guest pass operators. This might typically be a lobby attendant, whose responsibilities would include logging into a special website provided by the Zone Director to create guest passes for guests of the company. A guest would then refer to the printed copy of their guest pass, log into the guest pass captive portal, and type in an alphanumeric password known as the guest pass key to gain access to the wireless LAN. Lastly, if you choose to implement a Whisper hotspot service, the Zone Director can be configured to support an external captive portal in conjunction with an external authentication database. If you're going to select some type of authentication that requires wireless LAN users to submit a username and password for their credentials, the Zone Director must be able to reach some sort of a database where it can check the validity of those credentials. Now, as I've previously mentioned, you can either choose to configure those credentials locally, right within the Zone Director's own local database, or you can choose to offload this task to an external database. On this slide, you can see some examples of various features within the Zone Director that require user authentication. Now, if your network will only need to maintain a small quantity of user credentials, and you only plan on deploying 1 or 2 Zone Director controllers, then a simple solution can be to configure all of your valid usernames, passwords, and roles within the Zone Director's own local database. The obvious downside to this is that when you're using multiple Zone Directors, they do not share or keep track of each other's local user databases, so you'd have to manually replicate that database and any changes to it across each individual Zone Director. The only caveat to this is that when you are using the Ruckus Smart Redundancy feature, in which 2 Zone Directors can synchronize their configurations and databases. But even in that case, only one of those controllers is actually functional and in the active state, while the other is passive and in the standby state. Let's look at the steps involved when a wireless LAN user invokes a feature that makes use of credentials stored within the local database of the Zone Director. First, a user would associate to the wireless LAN. At some point in the process, the user would be expected to open their web browser, whereupon they would be redirected to the Zone Director's captive portal, requiring them to type in their unique username and password. Upon receiving those credentials, the Zone Director would realize that this particular authentication feature had been configured to use the local database, and so those credentials would be checked against that database. Upon successful authentication, the Zone Director would display another page informing the user that their credentials had passed. At that point, the Zone Director could be configured to either redirect the user back to the original website they had requested, or to redirect them to another website of their choice. Here you can see where within the Zone Director's web user interface that you can verify existing users and create new ones. You would start by clicking on the Configure tab and then select the Users menu item. In this particular screenshot, you can see that there are currently 4 users configured within the local database of the controller. The role that a user is assigned to determines what wireless privileges that user has, and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Under the Actions column, you can see that there are 3 actions for each username: Edit, Clone, and Print. If you select Edit, you can change various things about that username, such as its description, password, and role. If you plan on having many usernames that are virtually identical in their permissions, you can start with one and clone it. By selecting Clone, it's similar to a copy function, which creates a new entry in the database with the exact same parameters as the one that you just cloned. You can also select the Print action, which prints a user instruction sheet for that user, which I'll show you on the next slide. So what if you want to create a new entry in this database? Well, to do that, you simply click on the link titled Create New, which would bring up a pop-up window in which you can create your new entry. Within that window, you must type in the username and password as well as confirm that password. Now, if you type something in the full name field, it doesn't affect how that user will authenticate to the Zone Director. It just affects how his or her name is displayed in various fields when monitoring that user. The default role that every user is assigned to is named, appropriately enough, Default. Now, unless you change it, this role titled Default allows users to access all wireless LANs, allows them to create guest passes for other users, if you enable that feature, but does not give users any administrative privileges within the Zone Director's own GUI. As I mentioned in the previous slide, one of the actions you could select next to a username in the local database is the Print action. If you select this action, it gives you the ability to print a user instructions sheet that looks like this one. You might want to include a sheet such as this within a new employee's handbook or binder when they first join your company. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video discussing the differences between using the local authentication database or external databases, as well as how to configure individual users within the Zone Director's local database. I hope you found it to be helpful. The next set of videos will cover the details of user roles and then how all of this ties into the features of Zero IT and DPSK. Hello and welcome to this video tutorial covering